Hello, my dear friends. They looked like goddesses, but they reeked of rot. Behind every jewelled mirror in Versailles hid a world that never truly washed, a palace where women cleaned their faces with men's spit water, perfumed their decay, and called the stench refinement, the silk gowns, the candles, the laughter, all shimmered above layers of filth and denial. What passed for beauty was built on the quiet suffering of bodies that weren't allowed to breathe, bleed, or smell like life itself. Tonight, we step through the perfume and into the truth, the disgusting hygiene habits of Versailles women. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to enter the private chambers of a Versailles lady at dawn, the first thing to notice would be the quiet clinking of silver basins being carried in by servants. The air would still be cool, filled with the faint odour of perfume and candle wax. A maid would kneel beside a gilded stand, pouring water from a porcelain jug into a shallow bowl. To an outsider, it might seem like a graceful ritual of morning cleansing. Yet few would guess that the water swirling in that elegant basin had already been used, moments earlier, by a nobleman shaving his beard or clearing his throat into it. This was no mistake. It was custom. The discarded water from the gentlemen's chambers was collected, carried up marble staircases, and offered to the ladies of the court as if it were precious. To them, it was not waste but refinement. They believed that the faint scent of a man's cologne, mixed with the trace of his skin, lent a mysterious charm to the complexion. It is almost comical that the women of the most polished court in Europe willingly dabbed their faces with the very water men had spat in. The maids moved in silence, trained not to reveal disgust. A few petals would be dropped into the bowl, rose, jasmine, or sometimes orange blossom, to hide the unpleasant odour that lingered faintly beneath the perfume. The noblewoman would then lift a lace cloth, dip it into the water, and gently pat her cheeks. Her reflection in the mirror would shimmer in the candlelight, the soft touch of contaminated water gliding across powdered skin. The room smelled of sweet decay, like flowers rotting under silk. But in Versailles, scent was everything. To smell of a man was to smell of privilege. The servants, who knew the truth of where the water came from, kept their eyes low. They had seen the basins collected from the men's rooms, cloudy with soap and stubble, sometimes with a faint film of saliva, but their duty was to deliver, not to judge. In the court's strange hierarchy of hygiene, the act of washing was less about cleanliness and more about imitation. The king's habits dictated the behaviour of the entire palace. If he preferred a certain lotion, others used it. If his barber's water was reused, so was everyone else's. Clean water was rare and precious. The fountains glittered outside, but the pipes that carried water into the palace were unreliable, sometimes delivering more rust than purity. To waste water was a sign of ignorance. To reuse it, especially water touched by a nobleman, was considered elegant restraint. It is as absurd as if today someone bottled the water from a celebrity's sink and sold it as skincare. Yet in Versailles, the illusion of refinement mattered more than hygiene. The basins themselves were ornate, crafted from silver or porcelain, their edges carved with cherubs or gold leaves, but beauty disguised filth. When the maid poured the reused water, she did so with a steady hand, ensuring the petals floated just right. The lady would hum softly as she cleansed, believing that this mixture, a blend of masculine essence and floral disguise, could preserve her youth. Her face, pale and powdered, was the emblem of control and class. Dirt and decay could exist behind the curtain, but never on her skin. The ritual was a performance, a quiet theatre of denial that took place every morning before the mirrors of Versailles. In the grand corridors, the smell of colognes mixed with the damp scent of old water. It lingered on the hands of servants, on the towels hung to dry, on the perfume bottles stacked near the mirrors. None of this seemed strange to those who lived within the palace. They had learned to confuse fragrance with purity. Even physicians of the time advised gentle washing with used water, claiming it softened the skin. It was less about science and more about social comfort. To reuse something from a man of status was to share in his aura. To wash with plain, fresh water would have seemed almost crude. At night, the same ladies who dabbed their faces with stale water attended glittering balls, their cheeks glowing faintly under candlelight. Compliments were exchanged on the smoothness of their skin, the delicate scent of their perfume. No one spoke of the basins in the servants' corridors, lined with cloudy water waiting to be reused. The truth was hidden beneath layers of powder and etiquette. What mattered was the image, clean, radiant, and touched by nobility. I cannot help but feel uneasy imagining such beauty rituals carried out in rooms that smelled faintly of another person's morning breath. The ritual reflected a deeper reality about Versailles. Cleanliness was a performance, not a condition. The palace itself was polished marble on the surface, but rotting beneath. The pipes leaked, the drains overflowed, and the gardens carried the stench of waste disguised by perfume. In this world, appearances ruled over sense. A face washed in a man's leftovers could still be called pure, as long as it looked pure. The water shimmered in the light, the petals floated, and the illusion remained intact. They washed their faces not to remove dirt, but to replace it with a story of elegance. Beneath the fragrance and the flowers was a truth they never wished to touch. And perhaps that is what made Versailles both magnificent and monstrous. They called it refinement. I call it decay wearing silk. Even now, the thought lingers, what else did they reuse in the name of beauty, believing it made them more divine? In the chambers of Versailles, everything glittered: the gold-framed mirrors, the embroidered drapes, the marble floors polished to a mirrored sheen. Yet beneath all that beauty, a strange contradiction thrived. Cleanliness was not a matter of health, but of appearance, and the women of the court learned to maintain it with elegance that defied logic. After using their lavish commodes, they did not wash with soap or reach for a towel. Instead, they turned to a thick, fur-covered rug lying gracefully beside the chair. It was soft, richly coloured, and decorated with threads of silver and gold. It was not placed there for comfort, nor as decoration, but for wiping hands. The same rug that brushed against their shoes became the final step of their toilet ritual. The act was so ordinary within those walls that no one even questioned it. It is almost absurd to imagine the women of the most dazzling palace in Europe wiping their hands on what was essentially a shared carpet, then calling it grace. The rugs of Versailles were works of art, often woven in the royal workshops of Aubusson, or imported from distant lands. Each one could take months to complete. They were symbols of wealth, covered with flowers, mythological creatures, and golden borders. Yet despite their beauty, they carried an invisible burden. When the women of the palace finished their business, they simply leaned forward and rubbed their fingertips into the plush fibres, letting the softness absorb what no one spoke of. Water was considered dangerous to the body. The chill of it was said to cause illness, especially to delicate skin. So they relied on the rugs instead, believing the thick weave would cleanse without harm. The irony was that the rugs never saw a drop of clean water. They were beaten outside the windows to shake off dust, but never truly washed. In the quiet mornings, maids entered these chambers with their heads bowed. They rolled the heavy rugs, carried them to the balconies, and shook them carefully so as not to offend the eye with what might fall from them. Dust, hair, and dried residue floated out into the sunlight, unseen by those who lived in luxury. The maids would perfume the rugs afterward, sprinkling them with rosewater or violet oil. This did not purify, it disguised. The thick scent filled the room once again, masking the truth. From that point on, the rug was ready for another day's service. It is like the idea of someone today spraying perfume on a kitchen cloth after weeks of use and declaring it fresh. But in Versailles, such absurdity was not only tolerated, it was considered refinement. Every corner of the palace followed the same strange code. Appearances ruled over hygiene, and elegance demanded denial. Ladies would adjust their gowns and step lightly over the very rug they had used moments before, their faces serene, their fingers gloved once again. The servants removed nothing, replaced nothing, and spoke of nothing. The word dirt itself was unfit for such places. Instead, people used gentler terms, traces, odours, essences. Everything unpleasant was softened by language, transformed into something that could coexist with gold and lace. The rugs absorbed it all, silent witnesses to the daily rituals of the most polished women in Europe. Visitors to Versailles often praised the palace's perfection. They wrote of the glittering halls, the dazzling gowns, the endless perfumes. Few noticed the faint mustiness beneath it all. The air inside the private chambers carried a sweetness that turned heavy the longer one stayed. The mixture of unwashed fabric, perfume, and warm air created a fragrance unique to Versailles, beautiful from afar, unsettling up close. The women who lived there had long stopped noticing. They believed the scent of the palace itself was proof of nobility, as if only the truly refined could live surrounded by such air. For these women, every movement had to appear effortless. To wash would mean to labour, and labour was for servants. Instead, they perfected gestures that looked clean. A dab of perfume on the wrist replaced soap, a touch of powder on the face replaced freshness, and the rug replaced water. It is strange to think that the same women who bathed in compliments from courtiers refused to bathe in actual water. Their concept of purity existed only in the mirror, where everything could be arranged into harmony. Sometimes, after the morning routines were done, the ladies would sit near the windows, reading letters or arranging their hair. Beneath their feet lay the same rug, now carrying the scent of perfume layered over everything it hid. When the sunlight caught its fibres, they glittered softly, a deceitful beauty concealing decay. The rugs were never removed unless they became visibly worn, and even then, the replacements were treated the same way. The idea of scrubbing or washing them was unthinkable. Water might ruin the fabric, they said. In truth, it might only have revealed what they preferred not to see. In the servants' quarters, whispers travelled quietly. The maids knew what clung to those rugs. They were the ones who lifted them, who coughed through clouds of old perfume and powder when shaking them out. Some pitied their mistresses, others despised them, but none dared speak. Versailles ran on silence as much as on gold. To notice filth was to be vulgar, and vulgarity was worse than sickness. The court's logic was inverted. What was clean might make you ill, but what was filthy could be made safe with a touch of fragrance. It was belief, not reason, that ruled the body. By evening, the palace glowed with candlelight. Guests danced in perfume-thick air while the same rugs lay quietly beneath layers of skirts and shoes. The elegance of the scene was hypnotic. Musicians played, jewels glittered, and the scent of roses filled the halls. But hidden within that fragrance was the sour echo of the morning's rituals. If the rugs could speak, they would tell of 1,000 delicate hands wiping the residue of daily life upon them, and 1,000 bottles of perfume poured over to hide the evidence. They would tell of how beauty, in that world, depended entirely on denial. I often think about how those women, draped in satin and lace, believed they were living at the height of civilization, while beneath their feet lay the truth they refused to touch. Their rugs were metaphors for Versailles itself, dazzling on the surface, rotting underneath. Every act of grace contained something unspeakable. something human that had to be hidden. Cleanliness, as they understood it, was not a state, but a performance. The rugs endured silently, absorbing years of habits and secrets, each one becoming heavier, darker, more perfumed. They symbolized the strange luxury of a court that preferred illusion to comfort and beauty to health. To live in Versailles was to exist in a carefully choreographed lie. Every gesture was rehearsed, every scent calculated, every stain ignored, even the smallest detail, the way a woman wiped her hands, carried the weight of pride and decay intertwined. They called it refinement because it smelled of flowers, but underneath, it was simply the scent of denial. They believed they were preserving grace, but they were only teaching themselves to live with filth. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all is that those golden rugs, meant to symbolize purity and power, were nothing more than soft, perfumed graves for the truth. In the private rooms of Versailles, the air itself seemed perfumed. Every inch of space, from the velvet curtains to the silk gowns, carried the faint sweetness of flowers and spice. Yet behind this elegance was an odd, nearly pitiful ritual that blurred beauty with waste. When the scent on a lady's skin began to fade, she did not reach for a fresh bottle of perfume. Instead, she took up a thin handkerchief, the same one she had used that morning, and gently pressed it against her neck and wrists. The cloth absorbed what little fragrance remained, mixed with the warmth of her skin and the powder from her makeup. Then, in a gesture both strange and routine, she wrung that cloth into a basin of water. The liquid that fell was cloudy, scented faintly of roses and musk, and it became her lotion. With calm precision, she dipped her fingers into it and smoothed it once more over her arms and throat. It is almost laughable that the palace of perfection found virtue in washing the body with perfume that had already been used. For the women of Versailles, nothing was to be wasted, not even scent. Perfume was more than luxury, it was reputation. To smell pleasant was to appear pure, no matter what hid beneath the silk and lace. So the ritual of reusing fragrance became common, an unspoken secret passed between ladies' maids and their mistresses. The cloth, after absorbing the remnants of the morning's scent, was never discarded. It was pressed, folded, and reused. The soft fabric darkened by the oils of skin and fragrance. When dipped into water, those traces created a diluted mixture, a ghost of perfume that could be spread again to maintain the illusion of freshness. It is as absurd as the idea of collecting the steam from an old candle and calling it new light. Servants played a crucial role in this strange cycle of refinement. Each morning they laid out fresh linens, bowls of water, and bottles of scent. But by evening, the bowls held murky mixtures of perfume residue and sweat, which the women dabbed onto their skin with graceful indifference. To them, this was sophistication. To wash with plain water would have been vulgar. Clean water, unadorned by scent, belonged to peasants and laundresses. A Versailles lady must never appear practical. Even her cleanliness had to shimmer with artifice. The smell of these makeshift lotions filled the palace halls, soft, intoxicating, and faintly sour. As night fell, the air grew heavy with layers of reused fragrance. Each woman carried her own version of it, rose blended with musk, lavender with faint notes of decay. But rather than disgust, this smell was celebrated. It was the scent of belonging to the court, of sharing in its rituals. Men complimented it without realizing what they inhaled. They praised its richness, not knowing it was a mixture of yesterday's perfume and today's sweat. In truth, perfume was the only mask Versailles could not remove. It clung to everything: hair, furniture, sheets, even the air itself. The palace was a world built on fragrance and denial. Women feared smelling human, so they learned to smell layered. When the fresh scent faded, they recycled it. When that faded, they mixed it with something new. It was a constant circle of disguise. To smell clean, They reused what was already soiled. To appear delicate, they clung to the residue of decay. The science of hygiene had no place here. The women were told that perfume could cleanse, that flowers had purifying powers. They believed that roses softened the skin and that musk drew out impurities. In truth, these mixtures only trapped dirt beneath the surface, clogging pores and inflaming the skin. Yet pain was ignored in favour of grace. If the lotion stung, that was the mark of refinement. If the scent was too strong, that meant it was working. The more it hurt, the more they smiled. Versailles turned suffering into ritual, and ritual into elegance. I can almost see those rooms filled with mirrors, where beauty meant reapplying yesterday's perfume and calling it rebirth. The maids, ever silent, were the ones who saw the truth most clearly. They carried the basins away each night, heavy with reused water and clumps of powder. The next morning, they returned with new flowers to steep in the same bowls, hiding the staleness beneath the illusion of freshness. They watched as their mistresses repeated the same routine, dabbing, wringing, patting, and breathing deeply as if surrounded by holiness. It was a strange devotion, a worship of scent that replaced real purity with fantasy. In the grand corridors, the smell became part of the identity of Versailles itself. Visitors from other courts often spoke of the fragrance that clung to the palace, describing it as both divine and oppressive. They could not tell where the perfume ended and the rot began. The boundary between luxury and decay had dissolved completely. The palace was a bottle that could never be emptied, always refilled with the same residue disguised as new. At the heart of this ritual was fear of being ordinary, of smelling mortal, of revealing the body beneath the gown. Every woman at court lived in terror of imperfection. They were taught to preserve the illusion of beauty at any cost. Even as their skin itched, their pores burned, and their perfumes turned sour, they smiled. Cleanliness became the theatre, and scent its costume. The more artificial it became, the more noble it appeared. By evening, when they entered the ballroom beneath glittering chandeliers, their perfume still lingered faintly, though it had been reapplied from the same reused mixture. The men bowed, the women curtsied, and the air grew thick with sweetness layered over exhaustion. The mirrors reflected faces that glowed not from health, but from oil and powder, skins smoothed by diluted perfume water that carried the scent of the entire day. And yet, to those around them, they looked divine. The illusion was complete. The palace smelled perfect, so long as no one breathed too deeply. They believed reusing perfume made them thrifty and refined, but it only made them prisoners of their own illusion. They mistook the smell of old fragrance for proof of grace, never realizing it was the scent of decay refusing to die. And perhaps the saddest truth of all is that the air of Versailles, remembered for its beauty, was nothing more than the perfume of things too proud to be washed away. Versailles was a world built on repetition, of gestures, of rituals, of illusions. Inside its gilded walls, women learned that everything could be reused except their feelings. Water was recycled, cloth was rinsed and wrung again, perfume was pressed from the same worn linen. Even the air itself felt second-hand, filled with layers of scent that never truly faded. Yet amid all this recycling of matter, emotion was forbidden to resurface. The tears shed in the privacy of their rooms were wiped quickly, as though they might stain the perfection of the court. No one spoke of exhaustion. No one mentioned loneliness. The palace demanded that all things serve beauty, and beauty allowed no trace of pain. It is almost darkly funny that in the cleanest-looking place in France, emotion itself was considered dirt. The women of Versailles lived surrounded by mirrors. Every movement was a performance, every glance a reflection of control. Their faces were pale, powdered smooth, untouched by the redness of crying or the flush of anger. The very idea of showing emotion was indecent, almost as shameful as smelling of sweat. To frown was to fail at elegance, To sigh was to reveal weakness, and so they smiled, endlessly, mechanically, even when their hearts trembled beneath layers of lace and bone stays. The court did not need truth, it needed theatre. It is like a modern woman standing before a camera, holding a perfect smile while her world quietly falls apart. Behind closed doors, maids often found their mistresses seated before mirrors long after midnight, faces motionless, hands resting on laps. The candles burned low, their light flickering against walls painted with scenes of eternal pleasure. Yet in that silence, the illusion thinned. A woman might lower her eyes, touch her cheek where tears had once dried, and then rise to hide it all again. There was no room for sadness in a palace that prided itself on perfection. Even grief was to be worn like jewellery, polished, controlled, and invisible. Every emotion at Versailles was recycled into manner. Anger became charm, despair turned into poise, boredom disguised itself as serenity. The language of the body was rewritten to fit the palace's rules. A slow blink meant indifference, a faint smile meant approval, and a perfectly still face meant triumph. The women learned to repress themselves so deeply that even in solitude, they performed. Their hearts became as disciplined as their posture, their souls as fragile as the porcelain they displayed on their tables. The price of elegance was silence. The court thrived on contradiction. Beneath chandeliers that sparkled with hundreds of candles, conversations floated like music, light and meaningless. The women, adorned in silks and jewels, spoke softly of fashion and feasts, never of fatigue or fear. Every word was measured, every laugh rehearsed, and beneath the perfume and powder, their skin itched, their lungs burned from the heavy air, and their hearts ached from the weight of pretending. Versailles did not only demand beauty, it demanded the burial of the self. I often think that the cruelest rule in that palace was not how to dress or walk, but how to feel nothing and smile through it. In the mornings, when sunlight slipped through the lace curtains, the ritual began again. Servants brought reused basins of water, cloths heavy with perfume, and garments still carrying the scent of yesterday's body. The women washed their faces in silence, wiped their hands on the same rugs, reapplied the same faded fragrance, and stepped into their roles. Nothing was truly fresh, not the water, not the air, not even the smiles. The cycle was endless, a soft prison gilded in gold leaf. The court celebrated endurance as a virtue. A woman who never complained was admired. A woman who fainted gracefully was praised for her delicacy. The more invisible her suffering, the more elegant she appeared. Tears were for peasants, for creatures untrained in control. At Versailles, restraint was divine. Those who broke the illusion faced ridicule and isolation. So the women learned early, cried in silence, bled in private, loved in secret, and always rose without a wrinkle. Their emotions became ghosts that haunted the corridors, unseen but ever present. To outsiders, Versailles appeared radiant, a living symbol of French perfection. But to those within, it was a cage disguised as a garden. Laughter echoed through the halls, but it never reached the heart. Every smile was weighed, every gesture calculated. The women were admired, painted, and immortalized in portraits that captured everything except truth. Those paintings still hang in museums, their faces serene, their eyes distant, their emotions carefully erased. It is almost possible to imagine that if one could step close enough, one might smell the faint scent of old perfume and hear the silence of all they never said. By night, after the last waltz faded and the candles burned low, the palace exhaled. Behind locked doors, corsets were loosened, wigs removed, and skin wiped clean with reused cloths. But even then, the habit of composure remained. They moved quietly, gracefully, even when no one was watching. The performance had seeped into their bones. Freedom had become as unfamiliar as clean air. They reused everything: water, cloth, scent, because nothing in Versailles was meant to be wasted, not even illusion. They washed their faces and hearts in the same silence, hiding every trace of what it meant to be human. Perhaps the most tragic truth of all is that behind those perfect faces and perfumed rooms, emotion was the only thing too pure to survive reuse. When the Palace of Versailles fell into silence at night, and the sound of music faded beneath the marble ceilings, the women of the court began their final ritual of beauty. The mirrors still glowed with candlelight, and before them, trays of small porcelain bowls waited, filled with mixtures that shimmered faintly under the flicker of flame. Inside these bowls was a strange substance, pale, soft, and glistening, a paste made from the wings of crushed butterflies. The women believed it was a gift of fortune, a charm of beauty and luck. They thought the powder of these fragile creatures could bless their skin with the same delicate radiance that once shimmered on the wings. To them, it was a secret of grace. To us, it would look like madness. It is almost grotesque to imagine that in a palace overflowing with gold, beauty was made from the bodies of insects. The preparation of this mixture was a ritual of its own. Servants would collect dead butterflies from the gardens, where they clung to rose bushes or fell into the fountains. Their wings, fragile and iridescent, were carefully gathered and dried. Then, with a mortar and pestle, they were ground into a fine powder, losing all colour as they turned to dust. Into this, the women mixed sour milk or leftover yogurt, creating a thick, cool paste. The scent was faintly acidic, tinged with something earthy and unsettling. When spread on the skin, it dried into a thin film that tightened the face, leaving the sensation of being wrapped in something foreign and fragile. It is as strange as if someone today made a luxury face mask from the ashes of moths and called it elegance. They applied it slowly, smoothing it over their cheeks, forehead, and neck. Some believed the spirits of butterflies lingered in the powder, carrying good fortune to those who wore it. Others whispered that the chitin from their wings had the power to lighten skin. Pale skin, after all, was the highest symbol of refinement. It meant one was untouched by labour or sunlight. To be pale was to be powerful, and so even the dead wings of butterflies became tools of vanity. The palace, obsessed with perfection, left no boundary between beauty and cruelty. When the candles dimmed and the women slipped into their enormous beds, the scent of the paste filled the room. The mixture, half floral and half sour, clung to their pillows and hair. Beneath silk covers embroidered with gold thread, they lay perfectly still, their faces stiff beneath the drying mask. The faintest movement would crack the film, so they learned to sleep without turning. The night became another performance, an imitation of rest rather than true sleep. Even in dreams, they were not allowed to let go. The servants who entered in the morning found their mistresses pale and rigid, the butterfly paste flaking off in small pieces that stuck to the linen sheets. They gathered the fallen bits with care, for nothing at Versailles was to be wasted. The remnants were scraped, mixed again with milk, and saved for later use. It was an endless cycle, a quiet horror disguised as grace. The same hands that applied perfume and jewels also spread the remnants of crushed life across their faces. Versailles had perfected the art of turning the natural world into decoration, and beauty itself into decay. I often think that these rituals were less about beauty than about control. Control over the body, the air, even the smallest living thing. The palace smelled constantly of roses and rot. In the mornings, when the maids opened the windows, the air from the gardens carried sweetness. But inside the rooms, the faint tang of old milk and crushed wings lingered. It was a smell that spoke of vanity and death intertwined. The women pretended not to notice. They smiled, powdered their faces again, and went about their day as if beauty could erase the scent of what created it. The powder, though unpleasant, gave them the pale glow they desired. Compliments from courtiers justified the discomfort, and the discomfort itself became a mark of refinement. In the mirrored halls, they passed each other like reflections of the same illusion, delicate, untouchable, and faintly unreal. Their faces gleamed under candlelight, soft and cold, with no trace of the living warmth beneath. The butterfly paste had left their skin smooth, but lifeless, almost waxen. The courtiers admired it, mistaking stillness for serenity. Versailles loved surfaces. What mattered was not that the women smelled of sour milk and decay, but that they looked divine under gold. At times, when the women washed away the paste, flakes of it fell into basins, glittering faintly as they mixed with reused water. The servants poured it out into the gardens, where it dried on the soil, an offering from the palace to the earth it pretended to transcend. Everything in Versailles returned to the same circle, life crushed into beauty, beauty disguised as purity, purity dissolving into decay. The butterfly paste was only one form of that cycle, a small act in a larger theatre of illusion. They believed the wings of butterflies could grant purity, but all they gave was the colour of death pressed into the skin. They wore decay like perfume, pretending it was charm. Perhaps the saddest thing is how sincerely they believed that beauty could be born from ruin, as if crushing grace itself could make them eternal. In the golden age of Versailles, the palace sparkled with fountains and marble baths. Yet the irony was cruel. Those who lived surrounded by water rarely had clean water to drink. Inside the endless chambers of silk and gilded mirrors, a quiet scarcity lurked behind the spectacle. Fresh water was a luxury reserved for the few, and even then it was never enough. When guests dined or washed their hands after a feast, the water used in their silver basins did not go to waste. Servants gathered it, poured it carefully into pitchers, and carried it away to be stored, filtered, and later boiled for drinking. The same liquid that had rinsed grease, perfume, and powder from noble hands became the evening drink of those who served them. It is almost too ironic that in a palace of fountains, people drank what others had already washed in. The process was performed with a kind of grim precision. After each banquet, the servants waited in line to collect the leftover water from dozens of basins. The mixture was cloudy, carrying the faint shimmer of oils and petals that guests used to perfume their hands. Pieces of crushed rose, lemon peel, and sometimes scraps of food floated on the surface. The water was poured into large copper pots, strained through linen cloths darkened with residue, and then left to sit until it was reused again. To the ladies of Versailles, it was simply reclaimed water. To the servants, it was survival. When the time came to boil it for drinking, the maids would test the temperature in the only way available to them, by mouth. They leaned over the steaming pot, lips barely touching the surface, drawing in a small sip to feel if it was cool enough to serve. The gesture looked delicate, but it was dangerous. The air above the pot was heavy with the smell of metal and soap, and the taste was bitter. Yet it was their duty to make sure the nobles did not burn their tongues. The same lips that tested this water might later refill perfume bottles or dust jewels, never revealing what they had just tasted. It is as disturbing as imagining someone today sipping from a public restroom sink to check if it's safe, only to serve it as fine tea. The idea of water being precious at Versailles sounds absurd, yet it was true. The palace had fountains that danced in the gardens, but those waters were decorative, not drinkable. The plumbing that fed the upper floors was poor, often delivering brown or stagnant water. Fetching fresh supplies from nearby rivers was a laborious task, and the water from those sources was often contaminated. So, out of necessity and vanity, the court reused whatever water it could. To drink the remnants of a noble's hand-washing was not shameful. It was considered resourceful. If the water had touched someone of high birth, perhaps it carried a trace of grace. That illusion made it easier to swallow. In the dim light of the servants' quarters, barrels of this recycled water stood against the walls. Their surfaces shimmered faintly with oil, catching the glow of candles. The air was thick with the mingled scents of perfume and metal. It smelled almost pleasant at first, floral, sweet, until one realized it was the smell of decay hiding beneath luxury. Servants moved quietly between the barrels, ladling out portions to heat for tea, washing, or even bathing the children of lesser staff. It was an invisible hierarchy within a visible paradise. Sometimes, a lady herself might sip the recycled water, unaware of its origins. Her maid would present it in a porcelain cup, steaming and fragrant after boiling. She might compliment its softness, believing it came from some special spring, not from a basin that had just held 20 other hands. In the mirrors of Versailles, truth was always disguised. The same illusion that painted filth as fragrance allowed people to drink contamination as elegance. The women of the palace trusted what shimmered. If the water was clear enough and smelled faintly of flowers, it was good. No one questioned where it came from. Illness was common, but no one dared to blame the palace. When a stomach sickness swept through the servants or a noblewoman fainted after dinner, it was called fatigue or bad air. The truth that the palace's beauty was poisoning itself was too dangerous to name. I often think of those basins, lined in gold, filled with water that touched every rank of the court, carrying both luxury and disease in equal measure. To the maids, the daily act of preparing this water became a ritual. They whispered prayers while boiling it, hoping the heat would cleanse more than just impurities. Their lives depended on that small deception, that boiling could make filth pure again, but the taste never left them. It lingered on the tongue, faintly perfumed, faintly rotten. Drinking it felt like swallowing the air of Versailles itself, beautiful, intoxicating, and wrong. At night, when the palace grew quiet and the fountains outside sang under the moonlight, the same water that once sparkled in basins now simmered in pots deep within the servants' kitchens. The contrast was cruel. Above, crystal glasses clinked in candlelit rooms. Below, a girl tested the temperature of recycled water with trembling lips. The hierarchy of purity was absolute. Those at the top perfumed their hands with it. Those at the bottom drank it. Cleanliness, in Versailles, flowed upward, never down. The following morning, as the noblewomen washed with fresh petals, the maids refilled their basins once more. The cycle continued, water for beauty first, thirst second. The illusion of abundance survived, as it always did, on the quiet suffering of those unseen. They called it refinement to reuse water, as if beauty made filth harmless. They drank perfume and called it purity, never tasting the truth beneath the sweetness. The cruelest illusion of Versailles was that even poison, once perfumed, could be mistaken for grace. In the glittering heart of Versailles, beauty was both a duty and a weapon. Every morning as the sun touched the gold-framed mirrors, women sat before their vanities surrounded by brushes, powders, and small glass jars of pigment. Yet not all of these colours came from elegance. Some came from the kitchen. When the fires from the royal kitchens cooled, and the smell of roasted meat still lingered in the air, servants gathered the blackened charcoal from beneath the grills. These remnants of the feast, greasy, oily, and still warm, were carried not to the trash but to the dressing rooms of noble women. There, they were ground into a fine dust and mixed with a little oil to make a thick, black cosmetic paste. With delicate precision, the women dipped their brushes and began to draw. It is almost ridiculous that the same ashes that cooked their supper became the tool for their beauty. The smell of the mixture was unmistakable, a faint burnt sweetness of fat and smoke that no perfume could entirely hide. Yet to the ladies of the court, this scent was no cause for shame. They called it natural, even exotic, a mark of cleverness and thrift. To use what the palace had already produced was seen as refinement. a kind of intellectual beauty. Every stroke of the brush turned waste into ornament, just as Versailles itself turned excess into art. The women leaned close to their mirrors, steady hands shaping their brows into soft, perfect arches. They believed the dark line of the eyebrow framed the soul. In truth, it framed the hypocrisy of a world that worshipped appearance above all else. It is as strange as if someone today painted their face with burnt cooking oil and called it sophistication. The charcoal, still holding the scent of roasted meat, clung to the air of the rooms. Mixed with perfume, it created an odd, layered fragrance, floral at first, but beneath it, something faintly animal, something alive. The servants, used to the smell, no longer noticed. They stood silently behind their mistresses, ready with cloths and powder to soften the shine of the oil. The women admired their reflections, proud of the way the black pigment contrasted with their pale, powdered faces. They called it grace, they called it art, but when the light shifted, the illusion faltered. The charcoal gleamed faintly, reminding everyone of what it truly was, a trace of the kitchen, a whisper of the fire that fed them, in the grand halls, where chandeliers cast shimmering light. The painted brows looked striking, even regal. Each line was sharp and deliberate, giving the women an air of control. No one dared to question the source of the pigment. To mention the kitchen was vulgar. To connect beauty with labour was shameful. So they smiled, perfectly framed in their deception, smelling faintly of roses and smoke. The men who bowed before them thought they saw refinement. They were seeing the residue of last night's roast. Beauty at Versailles was born from contradiction. Every element of luxury concealed something repulsive beneath it. Perfume made from rot, powders from lead, and now eyebrows drawn with ashen grease. Yet the court adored such inventions. The ability to transform filth into fashion was proof of superiority. To use what others discarded was not a sign of poverty but of wit. Those who could make beauty from ruin were considered the most civilized of all. I find it haunting that the more artificial their beauty became, the more they believed it was proof of divine order. The act of drawing eyebrows was almost ceremonial. The women sat still while maids prepared the charcoal paste, stirring it in small porcelain bowls. A candle flame flickered nearby, catching the dark sheen of the mixture. The brush glided gently across the skin, leaving behind thin black curves, identical from woman to woman, as if individuality itself had been powdered away. Perfection meant uniformity. The palace demanded that every face fit its design. To be too pale, too dark, too natural was a kind of rebellion. Only symmetry, only sameness, could survive under gold ceilings. By evening, when the ballroom filled with light and perfume, their brows framed faces that were as expressionless as masks. Under the chandeliers, the scent of roasted meats from the kitchens below drifted upward, merging almost seamlessly with the faint odour of the charcoal they wore. Versailles existed in that strange balance, a palace where beauty smelled faintly of dinner. Yet no one noticed. The music was too loud, the gowns too dazzling, the illusion too complete. What mattered was that they looked untouched, even as everything they used came from the waste of life itself. In the servants' quarters, after the women slept, the maids cleaned the brushes and bowls. The water turned grey, the smell of grease rising faintly as they poured it out into the gutters. They worked quickly, silently, before the morning ritual began again. Beauty at Versailles was not spontaneous. It was manufactured, recycled, repainted, reapplied, until it lost all trace of the real. The palace itself was no different, a monument to splendour built on decay. They believed turning ashes into art made them divine, when it only proved how desperate they were to outshine truth. They painted over the smell of the kitchen and called it grace. The truest reflection in the mirrors of Versailles was not their faces, but the fire that burned to keep them beautiful. Versailles was a palace that glowed like the surface of a mirror, reflecting light so perfectly that no one dared look beyond it. Every hallway, every fountain, every polished face was a promise, not of purity, but of illusion. The women who lived there were the architects of that illusion. They learned early that being clean mattered far less than looking clean. Their routines, elaborate and endless, were never meant to purify but to disguise. Everything in Versailles followed that rule. The powders, the perfumes, the oils, even the water they touched, none of it cleansed. It only covered. It is almost tragic that a society so obsessed with refinement never realized it was worshipping its own disguise. The mornings began with ritual. Servants entered carrying basins of reused water, scented faintly with rose or lavender to hide its staleness. The ladies dipped fine linen into the cloudy liquid and patted their faces delicately, smiling into the mirror as if performing a sacred act. The goal was not freshness, but the illusion of it. Afterward, they powdered their cheeks, painted their lips, and adjusted curls that had not been washed in weeks. Beneath the paint and the fragrance, their skin burned and itched, but discomfort was an acceptable price for beauty. Cleanliness, after all, was not about health, it was about control. The palace demanded faces that glowed, not bodies that breathed. The same principle guided everything they touched. Water was filtered through perfume rather than fire. Fabric was scented with amber to hide the odour of unwashed skin. Even their drinking cups were polished daily, though the water they held came from the same reused basins that had washed 100 hands. From afar, everything gleamed. Up close, everything reeked faintly of decay. The secret of Versailles was that no one cared. What mattered was not truth, but appearance. It is as if someone today scrubbed their face with makeup wipes, but never with soap, convincing themselves the scent of cleanliness was enough. Behind the mirrors and silk drapes, servants knew the real smell of the palace. They moved through corridors where perfume and rot blended into one. They carried away towels that had been used for weeks, rugs that no longer hid the stains beneath them, and basins that shimmered with residue. Yet the upper halls glowed as if untouched by dirt or time. The illusion was so complete that even the air seemed rehearsed, sweet when visitors arrived, stale again once they left. Versailles was not a home, it was a performance of perfection, repeated daily until no one remembered what honesty smelled like. The cosmetics used by the women of the court were symbols of this deception. Lead powder whitened the skin until it looked porcelain, while beneath it, the flesh burned and thinned. Perfumed oils hid rashes caused by the very products meant to beautify. The more damage they caused, the more makeup was applied to hide it. In this way, Versailles became the birthplace of the endless loop of appearance, a mask layered over another mask, until there was nothing left beneath but exhaustion. Yet no one called it deceit. They called it grace. They called it art. The courtiers believed that beauty was proof of virtue, and so long as they looked perfect, they were absolved of everything else. Even the palace itself lived by this philosophy. The grand halls were swept and perfumed, but the corners rotted quietly beneath layers of wax. The fountains outside sparkled in the sunlight, though the pipes that fed them were filled with stagnant sludge. Versailles existed as a lie so polished it became truth. Its beauty depended on denial, a denial so deep that even filth, when dressed in gold, became noble. To those who lived there, this pretense was survival. To appear clean was to be safe. To reveal imperfection was to risk exile. In private moments, the women must have felt the strain of this illusion. When they removed their jewellery and wigs, they could feel the powder cracking on their faces, the oils turning rancid on their skin. Some rubbed their arms with old perfume water, trying to soften the burning beneath. Others stared into the mirror, seeing not themselves but the mask Versailles had given them. Yet even in solitude, they maintained composure. The habit of appearing flawless had become part of their flesh. No one dared to look human. I often imagine the loneliness of such beauty, to live surrounded by mirrors and never once see your own reflection. The men of the court were no different. Their wigs carried powder thick enough to turn the air cloudy when they moved. Their clothes shimmered, their boots gleamed, and their hands, though calloused from nothing, were always perfumed. They smiled in the same way as the women, wide enough to seem sincere, restrained enough to hide everything. Versailles taught its people that to look clean was to have power. Filth, in any form, belonged only to servants and peasants. The result was a world that gleamed endlessly while quietly suffocating under its own perfume. Servants who left the palace often spoke of the smell that clung to them for days, not the sweetness of flowers, but a dense chemical odour that refused to fade. It was the scent of Versailles itself, both beautiful and rotten, both delicate and oppressive. Even the gardens, perfectly trimmed and perfumed, hid the waste of the palace beneath their soil. Every rose bloomed above decay. Every breath of fragrance was a mask. The illusion was perfect because everyone chose to believe it. The deeper tragedy was not the filth, but the belief that pretending was enough. Versailles did not strive to be clean, it strove to be admired. The women powdered their skin, the men polished their boots, and the palace perfumed its fountains. Together, they created a world that glowed brighter than truth could ever allow. The illusion of cleanliness became more important than life itself. When sickness spread, they blamed the poor. When the air grew foul, they blamed the wind, never the palace, never the vanity that kept it glistening while everything beneath withered. Each night, as the candles burned low, the mirrors reflected faces that glowed faintly from oil and sweat beneath layers of powder. The women sat quietly, their skin sticky, their lungs filled with the perfume of the day. Outside, the fountains whispered purity. Inside, everything smelled of fatigue. But in Versailles, exhaustion was not to be shown. It was to be powdered, perfumed, and presented as poise. Even in sleep, they remained perfect. They believed that to look clean was enough, that the shimmer of powder could replace the touch of water. They mistook the scent of perfume for proof of purity, never realizing they were suffocating beneath their own disguise. The true art of Versailles was not beauty, but pretense, a kingdom that learned to live inside its own reflection, afraid of what it would find beneath the surface. In the golden mirrors of Versailles, smiles mattered as much as silk. A perfect mouth was a symbol of grace, a soft curve that suggested refinement and calm. But behind those smiles, teeth told another story. Toothbrushes were rare, and true dental care was almost unknown. So the women of the court turned to what they believed was nature's elegance, citrus. Instead of brushing, they bit into orange peels, grinding them gently between their teeth to freshen their breath. The act looked charming from afar, like a lady indulging in fruit after a meal, but it was far from harmless. The sharp oils from the peel stung their gums and stripped the enamel from their teeth, leaving behind a fleeting freshness that masked slow decay. It is almost painful to imagine that the same gesture that made them appear refined was quietly destroying their smiles. The belief came from imitation. Oranges were expensive, rare, and symbolic of status. To possess them meant access to luxury itself. At court, ladies displayed bowls of citrus fruits not to eat, but to be seen with them, a quiet way to show wealth. Over time, they began using the peels for beauty. The bitter rind, rich with oils, gave a temporary brightness to the lips and teeth. Some would chew it softly in the mornings, believing it removed odour and left a pleasant scent when they spoke. The taste was sharp, almost medicinal, but Versailles loved anything that looked effortless. To say you had brushed your teeth like a servant was crude. To say you had freshened your mouth with fruit was art. The truth was less elegant. Those same oils burned the gums and caused swelling that never fully healed. The women endured it, telling themselves that pain was the price of beauty. Some even claimed that the tingling sensation meant the peel was cleansing them. Servants whispered that their mistresses' gums bled into the linen napkins they carried discreetly, yet no one dared to question the practice. A pale face, powdered skin, and a faint citrus scent. That was what passed for purity in Versailles. It is as strange as if someone today brushed with perfume and called it hygiene. To intensify the effect, many followed the orange peel with a rinse of strong liquor. They poured brandy or wine into delicate glass cups and swished it gently, savouring the sting. The alcohol masked the taste of rot, turning bad breath into something almost sweet. But the relief was brief. The fumes clung to their tongues, and the combination of acid and alcohol corroded what little health their mouths had left. Yet even this was considered stylish. The faint scent of brandy on a lady's breath suggested sophistication, as though she had just come from a private conversation with elegance itself. In the endless routines of Versailles, these rituals became habits of survival, not against dirt, but against imperfection. To appear clean was to exist. The palace rewarded illusion far more than truth. The women learned to smile through pain, to speak softly even when their gums throbbed. They laughed in candlelight, showing teeth polished not by care but by acid. The brightness faded quickly, but under the glow of chandeliers, everything looked perfect enough. Servants saw the aftermath in the quiet hours, brushes stained with blood, napkins spotted with faint red marks, and small pieces of citrus discarded behind the dressing screens. They cleaned it all without comment. Their own teeth, though neglected, often lasted longer than those of their mistresses. But in Versailles, endurance